She walked into the wrong room and found the hospital's most feared surgeon standing there in nothing but a towel. What began as her most humiliating mistake would soon become the one connection that could save them both. Hello, my friends. Before we begin this amazing story, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and how your day is going, all right? And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The ancient, hallowed halls of St. Jude's Legacy Hospital in Boston were a world unto themselves, a place where the weight of prestige was as palpable as the scent of antiseptic. Within these walls, pressure and exhaustion were the twin currencies traded among the staff. It was here that Claire Miller, a 22-year-old nursing intern, moved like a phantom in crisp white scrubs. Originally from the working-class neighborhood of Dorchester, she navigated the intimidating corridors with a practiced quietness that was less about deference and more about survival. Her fierce intelligence and innate brilliance were treasures she kept locked away, concealed beneath a carefully maintained veil of profound shyness. She had learned early on that being noticed was a dangerous proposition, and here, among the scions of Boston's elite, she felt more exposed than ever before, a ghost haunting the edges of a life she desperately wanted but feared would ultimately reject her. Claire's existence was governed by a singular, deep-seated fear, the terror of being truly seen. A wound from her past, raw and unhealed, had taught her a brutal lesson, that visibility leads to vulnerability, and vulnerability invariably leads to pain. St. Jude's, with its rigid hierarchies and formidable figures, represented both the pinnacle of her ambitions and the landscape of her darkest nightmares. She felt like a permanent imposter, a scholarship kid who had wandered into a gilded cage filled with people who wore their privilege as comfortably as their tailored coats. Her sole objective was to remain functionally invisible, a sponge for knowledge that drew no attention to itself. She needed to absorb everything the hospital could teach her, complete her training, and escape without shattering into a million pieces. This careful act of self-erasure was her only defense against a world that felt determined to find her unworthy. After a grueling 12-hour shift in the intensive care unit, a bone-deep weariness settled over Claire like a physical cloak, blurring the edges of her reality. The constant symphony of beeping monitors, hushed, urgent conversations, and the ever-present specter of loss had drained her completely. Each step down the long, polished hallway felt like wading through deep water. All she craved was the comforting anonymity of her own worn-out clothes and the brief, sweet oblivion of the cool Boston night air on her face. The transition from intern Miller back to just Claire was a ritual she clung to, a sacred moment of shedding the skin of her professional life to find the person underneath. Tonight, the need for that escape was more acute than ever, a primal urge to disappear from the place that demanded so much of her soul. Her feet carried her toward the changing rooms, her mind a fog of clinical notes and lingering patient anxieties. She thought of the small apartment she shared, the promise of instant noodles, and the solace of silence. Surviving St. Jude's was a game of endurance, and she was a marathon runner hitting the most brutal stretch of the race. Every interaction was a calculation, every question a potential trap that could expose her perceived inadequacies. She was surrounded by the best and the brightest, many of whom came from medical dynasties, their paths paved with gold, while hers was a precarious climb up a crumbling cliff face. She didn't want their pity or their judgment. She just wanted to make it to the end of her internship, to prove to the one person who mattered, herself, that she belonged. Meanwhile, in another part of the hospital, Dr. Julian Croft, the Titan of St. Jude's, prepared to leave. At 38, he was the embodiment of the American medical aristocracy, a neurosurgeon whose hands were so legendarily steady that residents had nicknamed them the Croft Precision. Tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that cost more than Claire's monthly rent, He moved with an air of absolute authority. His world consisted of a Beacon Hill penthouse, AD, sprawling family estate on Martha's Vineyard, and a professional reputation that preceded him like a chilling, impressive shadow. He was feared not for a volatile temper, but for an unnerving clinical detachment. He dissected the most complex neurological cases with the same emotional distance he applied to every single person who crossed his path, building a fortress of brilliance around him. But this formidable armor of cold perfection concealed a man on the verge of a silent, catastrophic collapse. 6 months prior, Julian had lost a teenage patient on his operating table. It was a rare, unpreventable complication, a one-in-a-million tragedy that his godlike ego could not process as anything other than a profound personal failure. The ghost of the boy he couldn't save haunted his waking moments and tormented his sleep. The Croft precision, the very foundation of his identity, now betrayed him. When no one was looking, in the solitude of his office or the sterile quiet of a scrub room, his hands would tremble, a shocking rebellion of flesh and nerve. He felt like the ultimate fraud, a celebrated king presiding over a kingdom of medicine that he no longer believed he had the right to rule. His arrogance, once a shield, had curdled into a deep and corrosive self-loathing. He was seriously contemplating the unthinkable, abandoning medicine forever. The thought was a constant, insidious whisper in his mind. To walk away would be to admit defeat, to validate the terrifying new belief that he was a charlatan whose gift had vanished. Each successful surgery no longer brought satisfaction, only temporary relief from the crushing fear that the next one would be the one where his hands failed him in front of everyone. He was trapped in his own legend, suffocating under the weight of a perfection he could no longer sustain. The man who seemed to have everything was quietly losing the only thing that had ever defined him, his purpose. Exhaustion is a cruel and unreliable navigator. In the hushed quiet of 3 in the morning, Claire's feet, programmed by months of habit to turn left toward the female changing room, betrayed her. Her mind, clouded and foggy, didn't register the error as her hand pushed open the door to the right, the one marked with a stark male silhouette. She was expecting the familiar scent of floral soap and the comforting sight of her own small blue locker at the end of the row. She was already mentally peeling off her scrubs, anticipating the relief of soft cotton against her skin. The door swung inward on a silent hinge, and she stepped across the threshold, her gaze fixed on the floor, her mind miles away. Instead of floral soap, she was hit by a wall of dense, warm steam, thick with the sharp, clean scent of mint and eucalyptus. Her head snapped up, and then she saw him. Dr. Julian Croft, the hospital's untouchable deity, was standing by an open locker, wearing nothing but a low-slung white towel, knotted precariously at his hips. Water droplets glistened on the formidable landscape of his chest and shoulders, tracing slow paths through the crisp hair. Time itself seemed to freeze in the humid air. He turned at the soft click of the closing door, and his eyes, a startling glacial blue she had only ever seen from a safe distance, locked directly onto hers. The world stopped spinning. A silent scream caught in Claire's throat, a strangled gasp of pure, unadulterated horror. Her hands flew to her face in a desperate, instinctive gesture, a futile attempt to physically erase herself from the most mortifying moment of her life. But it was the nature of her reaction that shattered Julian's carefully constructed composure. He was accustomed to being met with awe, with fear, with professional deference. He was not, under any circumstances, prepared for this. She didn't just look away, she shrank into herself, her entire body seeming to collapse inward as quiet, desperate sobs of shame began to shake her shoulders. For one disorienting moment, his clinical detachment was pierced by a surge of profound curiosity. "I'm so sorry, doctor. I thought this was the women's... Please forgive me, I'm leaving." She stammered into her hands, her voice muffled and thick with tears. He watched her, his own defensive posture returning by instinct as he crossed his arms over his chest. "That seems a rather disproportionate reaction to a simple mistake," he said, his voice emerging drier and colder than he intended. He expected her to turn and flee, but instead he heard himself ask a question that surprised them both, cutting through the steam-filled silence. "Why are you crying?" The question, "Why are you crying?" echoed in the steam-filled room long after Claire had fled. She hadn't answered, of course. She had simply shaken her head, mumbled another incoherent apology, and scrambled out the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Julian was left, standing alone, the cold air from the hallway chilling the water on his skin. He was a man who trafficked in answers, in definitive diagnoses and precise surgical plans. Her raw, inexplicable shame was a puzzle he couldn't solve, an emotional variable that didn't fit any known equation. He found himself thinking about it for the rest of the night, the image of her small, trembling form overriding the persistent ghost of his own failure for the first time in months. Her reaction was not about him, he realized. It was about something deeper within her, a profound fragility that he found both unsettling and intensely intriguing. In the days that followed, Claire Miller ceased to be just another part of the hospital's scenery to him. Having been forced to see her in such a vulnerable state, he now found he couldn't stop seeing her everywhere. He began to notice the things she so desperately tried to hide. He saw the almost ethereal gentleness with which she tended to the most difficult patients, the ones others approached with a sense of weary duty. He watched, unseen, from a darkened doorway as she calmed a frightened elderly woman suffering from dementia, not with medication, but by patiently humming an old, half-forgotten lullaby until the woman's frantic eyes softened with recognition and peace. The sight struck a chord deep within him. It was a purity of care, a selfless act of connection that he, in all his years of celebrated practice, had never truly possessed. For Claire, his newfound attention was a waking nightmare. His presence in a room was a physical weight, a constant oppressive reminder of her deepest humiliation. The sight of his tall frame at the far end of a corridor was enough to send her scurrying in the opposite direction. She began to change her routes between wards, taking longer, more labyrinthine paths to avoid any possibility of an encounter. She would duck into supply closets, feigning a desperate search for gauze, or become intensely fascinated by a patient's chart on the wall whenever he drew near. It became a silent, awkward ballet in the hospital's corridors, a dance of avoidance and observation that only the two of them were truly aware of. Her world, once defined by the safety of invisibility, was now a minefield of potential sightings. This strange, unspoken tension did not go unnoticed, at least not by Claire's fellow interns. "You look like you've seen a ghost," remarked a friendly colleague named Sarah, as Claire nearly dropped a tray of medications after spotting Dr. Croft leaving the ICU. "Honestly, you'd think the man breathes fire. He's just a surgeon, not a monster." Claire forced a weak smile, unable to explain that it wasn't fear of his authority that made her heart leap into her throat, but the terror of being recognized by the one person who had witnessed her at her most exposed. Her carefully constructed walls were being tested, and she felt them cracking under the pressure of his steady, observant gaze. She just wanted to disappear again, to sink back into the comfortable grayness of being overlooked. The stalemate shattered during a harrowing code blue on a Tuesday afternoon. A patient went into sudden cardiac arrest, and the room exploded into a controlled chaos of doctors and nurses. Claire was on the front line, performing chest compressions until her arms screamed in protest, her mind racing to keep up with the shouted orders. Despite their frantic, desperate efforts, they lost him. The moment the attending physician called the time of death, a profound silence fell upon the room. Defeated and emotionally ravaged, Claire retreated to a deserted alcove. The patient's face seared into her memory. She fought back tears of frustration and helplessness, feeling the immense weight of a life she couldn't help save. The loss felt personal, another piece of evidence that she wasn't good enough for this place. She didn't hear him approach. One moment she was alone with her grief, the next, Dr. Julian Croft was standing there, his expression uncharacteristically soft. She tensed, expecting a critique or a platitude. Instead, his voice was quiet, devoid of its usual clinical edge. "That was a hard one," he said simply, his gaze fixed on the middle distance. "You did everything right. I saw you." The words landed in the tumultuous silence of her mind with shocking force. He wasn't just offering empty comfort, he was offering validation. He had seen her, not in a moment of shame, but in a moment of professional desperation, and he had judged her capable. It was an anchor in a raging sea, a moment of grace she never expected. He then gestured with his head down the hall. "The coffee from the vending machine in the basement is objectively the worst in Boston," he stated, a flicker of something almost like humor in his eyes. "But it's hot. Let me buy you a cup." The offer was so mundane, so jarringly normal, that it disarmed her completely. Her immediate instinct, born of pure panic, was to refuse. "No, thank you, doctor. I have to," she began, her voice trailing off as a small, crying girl suddenly darted past them, clearly lost and terrified. Without a second thought, Claire knelt down, her own distress forgotten. Julian watched as she spoke to the child in a low, soothing voice, her entire demeanor transforming into one of gentle reassurance. He found himself kneeling beside her, the two of them working together as a seamless, unspoken team. He used his authoritative presence to calm the approaching parents, while Claire kept the little girl focused and unafraid. It was a brief, shared moment of simple, effective teamwork, a small crisis averted with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the life and death drama of the ICU. The ice, so thick and formidable just moments before, had been irrevocably broken. The shared goal, however small, had forged a temporary alliance. When the grateful parents had departed with their daughter, Claire looked up at Julian, a faint, surprised blush on her cheeks. She had forgotten for a moment to be afraid of him. Later, sitting in a deserted waiting area, she held the warm, flimsy cup of terrible coffee in her hands. The silence between them was no longer fraught with tension, but filled with a quiet, shared exhaustion. He didn't pry or ask about the changing room. Instead, he asked a simple question. "Why nursing, Miller? You clearly have the intellect for medical school." She looked into her cup, surprised by her own willingness to answer. "I wanted to be the person who stays," she said softly. "When everything is falling apart, the doctors come and go. The nurses stay. They hold the hands. I think I wanted to be the person who holds the hand." It was the most honest thing she'd said to anyone at St. Jude's. Julian didn't respond immediately. He simply absorbed her words, his gaze thoughtful. In her simple, profound explanation, he heard an echo of the very thing he felt he had lost, the fundamental desire to care. His work had become about the puzzle, the victory, the application of skill. He had forgotten about the hand-holding. For the first time, he saw past the shy, skittish intern and saw the fierce, compassionate heart she guarded so fiercely. "That's a better reason than most," he finally said, his voice quiet. In that moment, a fragile, tentative connection was forged between them, built on bad coffee and a shared moment of truth in the lonely hours of the hospital. Their quiet coffee meetings became a tentative, unspoken ritual. They never planned them, but they would find each other in the hospital's quiet corners, a deserted stairwell, an empty family waiting room, the grim basement cafeteria after hours. Their conversations slowly expanded beyond the safe territory of medicine. He spoke, not of his great failure, but of the suffocating politics of the hospital board. the relentless pressure to maintain the hospital's reputation. He spoke to her not as an intern, but as a confidant, an equal. He found her perspective refreshingly devoid of ego and ambition, grounded in a simple, unwavering morality that he had long since misplaced in his own life. In his presence, Claire began to unfurl like a nervous bloom. The constant terror that had defined her days began to recede, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She found herself looking forward to their encounters, to the rare moments when a dry, witty comment from him would coax a genuine, shy smile from her. One evening, discussing a particularly difficult case, she found the courage to gently challenge his proposed approach to communicating with the family. "With respect, Doctor," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I think they need to hear it from a place of compassion, not just clinical reality." He stopped, looked at her, and instead of the rebuke she expected, he simply nodded, a look of genuine consideration on his face. "You're right," he admitted. This growing, fragile connection, however, did not go unnoticed. Head nurse Evelyn Pike, a formidable woman in her late 50s who had worked at St. Jude's for 30 years, saw everything. Nurse Pike was the embodiment of the old guard, a woman who thrived on the hospital's rigid class and professional structure. She was fiercely protective of its traditions and, in a way that was almost worshipful, of Dr. Julian Croft himself. He was, to her, the pinnacle of the hospital's prestige. A medical prince. She had watched him for years, her admiration hardening into a possessive, unrequited loyalty that she guarded jealously. To Nurse Pike, Claire Miller was a weed in a meticulously cultivated garden. She was a nobody from Dorchester, a scholarship girl whose presence was a disruption to the natural order of things. Pike watched their quiet coffees from the corner of her eye, her lips thinning into a line of sharp disapproval. She saw not a mentorship, not a friendship, but a transgression. She couldn't comprehend what a man like Dr. Croft, a man of his breeding and genius, would see in a mousy, insecure intern. In her mind, there could be only one explanation, and it was one that filled her with a cold, righteous fury. The girl had to be a predator. The first volley was fired not as a cannon blast, but as a poisoned dart. Finding Claire alone at the nurse's station one evening, Pike approached with a smile that didn't reach her cold, assessing eyes. "You're spending a lot of time with Dr. Croft," she said, her voice deceptively sweet. "Be careful, dear. Men like him don't build futures with girls like you. They collect them as curiosities for a while, and then they move on. It would be a shame for you to get the wrong idea and end up with a broken heart or a ruined reputation." The veiled threat hung in the air, chilling Claire to the bone. Soon after, the whispers began. Pike was a master of insinuation, planting seeds of doubt during her rounds with other senior staff members. "It's a shame, isn't it?" she'd say to another nurse, her voice laced with false concern. "Dr. Croft has been so vulnerable since that terrible business 6 months ago. A clever young thing could really take advantage." She painted Claire as a calculating social climber, a siren in scrubs using her youth to ensnare the hospital's most brilliant and currently most fragile star. The narrative was simple, ugly, and effective. The gossip spread through the hospitals, veins like a fever. Their quiet, innocent coffees in the basement were reframed as secret meetings. Julian's growing professional respect for Claire was twisted into inappropriate favoritism. Nurses who had once been friendly now looked at Claire with a mixture of suspicion and pity. "Did you see them heading for the south stairwell again?" one would whisper to another. "She's got him wrapped around her little finger. She knows exactly what she's doing." The narrative played perfectly into the hospital's ingrained class dynamics, the working-class girl punching far, far above her weight. The judgment was swift and merciless, poisoning the one place where Claire had started to feel a sliver of belonging. Her old fears came rushing back, stronger than ever. She was visible now, and just as she had always feared, she was being punished for it. The whispers followed her down the hallways. The sideways glances felt like physical blows. She tried to pull away from Julian, making excuses, to avoid their meetings, but he seemed not to notice the changing atmosphere, his focus solely on the genuine connection he felt with her. He was an island, protected by his status, while she was adrift in a sea of hostility he couldn't see. The situation escalated when Nurse Pike orchestrated a public reprimand. She chose her moment perfectly, during a busy shift handover with several other nurses and Julian present. Pike held up a chart, her finger pointing to a minor notation error. An error Claire was certain she hadn't made. "Intern Miller, this is unacceptable," Pike's voice rang out, sharp and authoritative. "This level of carelessness puts patients at risk. Perhaps you've been distracted lately?" The accusation was clear. It wasn't about the chart, it was a public branding, a deliberate act of humiliation designed to put Claire back in her place and send a clear message to Julian. Claire stood frozen, her face burning with shame, the eyes of her colleagues upon her. She saw the pity in some, the smug satisfaction in others. Julian immediately stepped forward to defend her, his voice low and angry. "Evelyn, this is a trivial matter to address in this manner. It's an obvious clerical slip, and it's inappropriate to handle it this way." But his defense only made it worse. In the eyes of the room, it was confirmation of Pike's narrative. He was protecting his favorite. The incident cemented Claire's oldest, deepest wound, the unshakable belief that being seen, being chosen, only ever led to pain and punishment. She felt the walls closing in, the fragile confidence she had begun to build crumbling into dust. Every one of Pike's warnings seemed to be coming true. She was a curiosity, a problem, a disruption. The hospital, which had once been a symbol of her dreams, now felt like a prison where she was the main exhibit in a trial she had no hope of winning. Her relationship with Julian, which had felt like a lifeline, now seemed like the very thing that was pulling her under. The joy and connection were being strangled by fear and judgment. She began to retreat into herself once more, the shy, hesitant smiles disappearing completely. She became quiet, efficient, and distant, trying to rebuild the walls that Julian had so patiently started to dismantle. She answered his questions with curt, professional responses and found reasons to be busy whenever he approached. The change was stark and immediate. She was trying to protect herself, but also in a way she couldn't yet articulate. She was trying to protect him from the trouble she believed she was causing. The weight of Pike's crusade was becoming too heavy to bear. Julian was bewildered by her sudden withdrawal. He tried to talk to her, to understand what had changed so suddenly, but she was evasive, her eyes constantly darting around as if searching for threats. "Claire, what's wrong?" he asked one evening, catching her arm gently in a deserted hallway. "Talk to me." She pulled her arm away as if burned. "Nothing is wrong, doctor," she said, her voice brittle. "I just need to focus on my work. I'm falling behind." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The easy intimacy they had shared was gone, replaced by a chasm of fear and misunderstanding. The final paragraphs of this section see the atmosphere curdling completely. The joy has been systematically drained from their interaction, replaced by the constant threat of external judgment. Claire is regressing, believing that the only solution is to sever the connection entirely. She is becoming convinced that she is the source of the problem, a toxic element in his world. This sets the stage perfectly for the dramatic actions she will take in the next section, where she decides the only way to save him is to destroy his perception of her. The drama has moved from internal and tentative to external and aggressive, paving the way for the climax. Seeing her defenses rebuilding day by day, Head Nurse Pike knew her campaign of whispers and public shaming was not enough. Dr. Croft's stubborn loyalty, his refusal to see Claire as anything but worthy, required a more decisive, more destructive strategy. With a sense of righteous purpose, she escalated her attack. She drafted a formal complaint to the hospital's governing board, a multi-page document filled with meticulously twisted truths and outright fabrications. She detailed their inappropriate private meetings, cited his unprofessional public defense of the intern, and cleverly framed Julian not as a colleague, but as a compromised, emotionally vulnerable man being expertly manipulated by a young, ambitious woman. It was a masterpiece of character assassination designed to corner him and expel Claire entirely. Julian was summoned to a sterile, intimidating boardroom facing a panel of stern-faced administrators. He was incandescent with rage. He read Pike's complaint, his knuckles white as he gripped the pages. "This is a vindictive, malicious lie," he seethed, his voice echoing in the quiet room. He launched into a passionate, furious defense of Claire, extolling her virtue, her rare talent for patient care, her innate goodness. But his very passion became the weapon used against him. To the board, his fury was not the righteous anger of a man defending a wronged colleague. It was proof of an unprofessional, deeply compromised emotional attachment. Just as Nurse Pike had calculated, his defense only served to tighten the noose around them both. The board's decision was delivered with cold, bureaucratic efficiency. In order to ensure the integrity of a full and impartial investigation into the serious ethical concerns raised, they concluded that intern Claire Miller was to be suspended from all duties, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the inquiry. The news reached Claire not through a person, but through the chilling finality of an official hospital email that appeared in her inbox. The subject line, "Formal Notice of Suspension," made her blood run cold. Reading the detached, legalistic prose, her world tilted on its axis. It was happening. The thing she had feared her entire life was finally, irrevocably happening. The formal, impersonal words on the screen triggered a complete psychological collapse. The suspension wasn't just a professional setback. It was the ultimate confirmation of her deepest, most defining wound. The trauma she had buried since she was 16 years old erupted with volcanic force. The memory of a trusted older teacher, a man who had praised her mind while abusing his position of power, flooded her senses. She had been powerless then, and his betrayal had taught her that being special, being noticed by someone with authority, was a curse. Now, history was repeating itself with horrifying precision. The pattern was undeniable, and in her fractured state, she could only draw one conclusion. She was the problem. In the depths of her despair, a toxic, self-sacrificing logic took hold. She was the danger. Her presence, her very existence in his orbit, was the catalyst for his professional ruin. She had seen the way the board members looked at him, the way his defense of her had been twisted into a weapon. To save the career of the only man who had ever made her feel truly safe and seen for who she was, she had to perform a brutal act of emotional surgery. She had to excise herself from his life completely. She had to make him let her go, and she knew there was only one way to do it. She had to make him hate her. She found him in his office, pacing like a caged lion. He was still radiating fury from his meeting with the board. "They can't do this, Claire," he said the moment she walked in, his voice a low growl. "This is Pike's vendetta. I will fight this. I will hire lawyers. I will not let them do this to you." Every word of his fierce, protective promise was another twist of the knife in her heart. His loyalty was the very thing she believed was destroying him, and it only hardened her terrible resolve. She had to make it stop. She lifted her chin, her face a pale, emotionless mask she had constructed just for this moment. "Don't," she said, her voice shockingly steady. He stopped pacing and stared at her, confused. "Don't fight for me. You can't." A terrible, cold dread began to dawn in his eyes. "What are you talking about?" She took a deep breath, the lie poised on her lips like a drop of poison. Evelyn Pike. She was right, Claire said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. She was right about me all along. I saw an opportunity. You were the most famous surgeon in Boston, and you were hurting. I saw a way to get ahead, to make a name for myself. The color drained from Julian's face. He looked at her as if he'd never seen her before, his mind struggling to reconcile the girl who hummed to dementia patients with the cold, calculating stranger standing before him. "No," he whispered. "I don't believe you." His disbelief was the cruelest part. It forced her to be even more brutal. "Believe it," she said, a single tear escaping and tracing a hot path down her cheek. "Please, don't ruin your life and your career for me. I'm not worth it." With that final, devastating blow, she turned and walked out of his office, leaving him shattered and utterly alone, forced to believe the worst, because the lie was the only truth that made sense of the chaos. The days that followed were a grey, featureless hell for Julian. Her confession had ripped the floor out from under his world. The one person who had pierced his armor, who had begun to heal the festering wound of his self-doubt, had just revealed that her compassion was a lie, her connection a strategy. The board's investigation became a distant hum of noise. He no longer had the will to fight. What was the point? She had admitted her guilt. His anger dissolved, replaced by a hollow, cavernous despair. The bitterness of her betrayal mingled with his own self-loathing, creating a potent cocktail of misery that left him numb. He went through the motions, a ghost haunting his own life. His famous clinical detachment returned, but it was no longer a shield of brilliant focus. It was the hollow shell of a man who had given up. The light in his glacial blue eyes went out. He avoided his colleagues, ate alone, and spent his nights staring at the Boston skyline from his penthouse, the silence of the large, empty space mocking him. He was a king who had been dethroned not by a rival, but by the devastating revelation that the one subject who had sworn fealty was, in fact, a traitor. He was completely and utterly alone with his ghosts. Then, the crisis erupted. On a frantic, rain-lashed afternoon, a 7-year-old girl named Lily was rushed into the St. Jude's ER. She was seizing, her life hanging by a thread. The scans revealed a nightmare, a rare, deeply situated cerebral aneurysm, a ticking time bomb in the most perilous region of her brain. It was a case so complex, so fraught with risk, that every doctor in the ER knew there was only one person in the city who could even attempt it. All eyes turned toward the office of the great Dr. Julian Croft, the man whose hands were said to perform miracles. But the man they needed was gone. Julian stared at the complex, terrifying scans of Lily's brain, and all he could see was the face of the teenage boy he had lost. The same unbearable risk, the same horrifying stakes. The ghost of that failure rose up and wrapped its icy hands around his throat, choking him with fear. The tremor in his own hands returned, a violent, undeniable quake. He couldn't do it. The risk of failing again, of having another child's death on his conscience, was more than he could bear. In a move that shocked the entire hospital, he refused the surgery. He retreated to his office, locked the door, and stared at his hands, convinced they were cursed. News of the unfolding tragedy spread through the hospital like a virus and eventually leaked outside. Claire's friend Sarah called her in a panic. "Claire, you won't believe this." Sarah's voice was a frantic whisper over the phone. "There's a little girl. They say she's going to die. Dr. Croft, he's refusing to operate. He's just locked himself in his office. Nobody knows what to do." The words struck Claire with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just about Julian's pain anymore. An innocent child was going to die because of a paralysis she knew she had helped create. In that instant, something inside her shifted. The timid, fearful intern who had run from judgment and hid in supply closets was gone. In her place stood a woman galvanized by a purpose far greater than her own pain. This was not about her reputation, not about her broken heart, not even about Julian's career. This was about a 7-year-old girl named Lily. Without a second thought, she threw on her coat, ran out of her small apartment, and got into a taxi. Her destination, the one place in the world she had sworn she would never set foot in again. She was going back to St. Jude's. She moved through the hospital with a focused, unstoppable energy she didn't know she possessed. She walked right past the security desk, ignored the stunned and hateful glare from head nurse Pike at the nurses' station, and marched directly to Julian's office at the end of the hall. She didn't knock. She threw the door open with such force that it banged. Against the wall, he was sitting in his chair, staring into space, a ghost in a perfectly tailored suit, the very picture of defeat. He looked up, his eyes hollow and empty. "You need to leave," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "No," she said, her own voice ringing with a strength that stunned them both. She walked to the center of the room, her gaze unwavering. "A little girl is going to die in an operating room down the hall, while you sit in here feeling sorry for yourself." He flinched as if she had slapped him. "You don't know anything about it," he muttered. "I know everything about it," she countered, her voice rising with passion. "I know you're terrified. I know you're haunted. But your failure 6 months ago wasn't in your hands, Julian. It was in your pride. You couldn't accept that some things are out of your control." He stood up, his face a mask of anguish and anger. "Get out, Claire." But she stood her ground, taking a step closer to him, her eyes blazing. "No, you listen to me. That boy's death was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault. This little girl's death, this one will be, because you're choosing to let your fear win." She took another breath, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. She looked directly at his trembling hands and then back into his eyes. "I trust these hands, Julian. I have always trusted these hands, even if you don't." Her words, her absolute and unwavering faith, cut through the dense fog of his despair like a bolt of lightning. It was the antithesis of her devastating lie. That had been a confession of betrayal. This was a declaration of absolute belief. It was a shock to his system, the one thing powerful enough to restart his heart. He stared at her, at the fierce, undeniable truth in her eyes. He then slowly, deliberately looked down at his own hands. For the first time in 6 long months, he didn't see a curse. He didn't see a liability. He saw a tool. He saw a gift. He saw a surgeon's hands. Without another word, he turned and strode past her, out of the office. His walk was no longer a defeated shuffle, but the purposeful stride of a man on a mission. The word spread like wildfire. Dr. Croft was heading to the OR. A collective sigh of relief and disbelief washed through the surgical floor. In the observation gallery overlooking Operating Room 3, Claire stood alone, her hand pressed against the cool glass. She watched as he scrubbed in with meticulous, focused intensity, his movements once again precise and certain. The fear was gone, replaced by a calm, formidable resolve. The surgery of his life was about to begin, with her as his silent, unwavering anchor. Inside the operating room, time seemed to bend. Under the intense, focused glare of the surgical lights, Dr. Julian Croft's hands were not just steady. They were imbued with a renewed grace, moving with an intuitive, fluid confidence that left the entire surgical team in a state of hushed awe. Every suture, every delicate maneuver around the perilous aneurysm was a testament to his rediscovered gift. He was not just a technician executing a procedure, he was an artist creating a masterpiece of redemption. Claire watched from the observation gallery, her own heart beating in time with the steady rhythm of the monitors below. She didn't breathe until, after hours of painstaking work, Julian stepped back from the table, lifted his gaze to the gallery, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He had done it. He had saved the child's life. The news of the successful, near-miraculous surgery sent a seismic shockwave through St. Jude's. Julian's public redemption was so absolute, so heroic, that it cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the shadows where conspiracies had festered. Emboldened by his triumph and disgusted by the cruelty they had witnessed, other nurses began to speak up. Claire's friend Sarah was the first to go to the hospital administration, providing a sworn statement about head nurse Pike's methodical campaign of slander. Others followed, corroborating the story, exposing the lies about the doctored chart, and painting a clear picture of a personal vendetta. The truth, once suppressed by fear and hospital hierarchy, finally came rushing into the light, undeniable and overwhelming. Faced with a mountain of testimony and the undeniable fact that the intern she had tried to destroy was instrumental in saving a child's life, Evelyn Pike's carefully constructed world imploded. Her web of deceit and manipulation unraveled completely. The board, scrambling to contain the scandal, had no choice but to act decisively. A formal public apology was issued to Claire Miller, clearing her name of all wrongdoing and retroactively expunging the suspension from her record. She was fully reinstated. Nurse Pike was offered a quiet, immediate and non-negotiable early retirement, a bloodless coup that ended her 30-year reign of terror. The institutional poison had been purged, leaving a clean slate in its wake. A week later, Julian requested another meeting with the hospital board. When he walked into the boardroom this time, he was not the enraged, defensive man they had seen before. He was calm, centered, and radiated an unshakable authority that had nothing to do with his reputation and everything to do with his newfound sense of self. He accepted their apology on Claire's behalf with quiet dignity, but he made it clear he was not finished. He began to speak about her integrity, her quiet strength, and the profound, transformative impact she'd had on him, not just as a doctor, but as a man. He told them that her brand of compassionate care was the very soul the hospital should strive for. Then, in front of the same panel of administrators who had so coldly suspended her, he laid his heart bare. "Let me be perfectly clear," he said, his voice steady and resonant, his gaze sweeping across each member of the board. "My professional respect for Ms. Miller is immeasurable, but my personal feelings go far beyond that. I love her. She is not a distraction from my work. She is the reason I was able to do my work again. In a place full of brilliant minds, hers is matched only by the brilliance of her heart. She is, without question, the best of us." This public declaration was the final, definitive blow to the last vestiges of gossip, a powerful act of love and validation that echoed through the entire hospital. He found her later that evening, not in his office or a crowded hallway, but by the large window of the deserted waiting area where they had once shared that first, terrible cup of vending machine coffee. Rain traced patterns on the glass, mirroring the city lights outside. The air between them was thick with everything that had happened, with all the words left unsaid. He didn't try to apologize for believing her terrible lie. His heart now understood the desperate, self-sacrificing place from which it had been born. He simply came to stand beside her, his presence a warm and comforting weight in the quiet room, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey through the fire. It was he who finally broke the peaceful silence, his voice soft but clear over the sound of the rain. "That day in my office, you told me you weren't worth it," he began, his eyes fixed on her reflection in the dark glass. She flinched at the memory, a shadow of the old pain crossing her face. He reached out, not to touch her, but just to hover his hand near hers, a gesture of infinite tenderness. "You were wrong, Claire," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You healed me long before I ever walked into that OR. For 6 months I was a ghost. You were the only one who saw me. You saved me first." His words were a balm, sinking deep into her soul and dissolving the last remnants of her fear, allowing her to finally see herself not as a wound, but as a source of immense strength. 1 year later. The scene is not one, of polished floors and sterile white walls. It is a rainy Tuesday night, and the world is confined to the warm, gentle chaos of a small and slightly cluttered apartment in a quiet Boston neighborhood. Rain streaks down the window panes, blurring the city lights into a soft, romantic glow. The air smells of old books and brewing tea. The atmosphere is one of profound, settled peace, a sanctuary built not of steel and glass, but of mutual healing and unassuming love. This is the home they have, built together, a world away from the pressures and prestige of St. Jude's. Julian is sitting on the floor, his back resting comfortably against the sofa where Claire is curled up, a thick woolen blanket draped over her legs. A half-empty mug of tea sits on a coaster beside him. She is reading aloud to him from a worn book of poetry, her voice a soft, soothing melody that weaves itself into the sound of the rain. The scene is breathtakingly ordinary, yet it represents an extraordinary victory. It is a portrait of their new normal, a quiet, shared intimacy that is more valuable than any award or professional accolade. This is the peace they have earned. He gently places his hand over hers on the book, stilling the page. She pauses her reading and looks down at him, a soft, questioning smile on her lips. He looks around the simple, loving space, at the crookedly hung pictures and the overflowing bookshelves, and then his gaze returns to her, his eyes full of a love so deep and certain. It's breathtaking. "You know," he says, his voice soft with a truth it took him a lifetime to find. "I spent my entire career thinking the answer, the cure, was always behind the most complicated door." He pauses, his gaze locking with hers. "I was wrong. I just had to walk through the right one by mistake." She smiles, a genuine, beautiful smile of pure happiness, and leans down to kiss him, sealing their shared journey of healing and acceptance. If this story moved you, please leave a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to believe in the power of second chances.